Yo, I'm Toycat, and the UK's new Labour government have announced that they are going to be increasing taxes. This is never popular or easy at the best of times, but right now it is especially hard because the Chancellor has ruled out raising VAT, national insurance, or income tax. These were all in the Labour manifesto, but these are the three biggest taxes in the UK, and also they have a vague pledge to not have tax rises on working people. So how exactly are they going to raise 22 billion to fix this hole in the public finances, and what exactly does it mean for the average taxpayer? Where is that money going to come from, and what taxes are going to have to go up? I think it'd be worth explaining that in today's video, because first things first, it's worth mentioning that they reference a 22 billion hole. You might hear about this and think, wow, is there 22 billion worth of public spending we need to fix? Is that how big the gap is between public expenditure and how much the government raises? And the answer is no, it's actually substantially higher. This was confirmed in April of this year. The budget deficit for the 2023/2024 year was 120 billion pounds. So that is to say it is 4.2% of economic output is borrowed, and that is a big deal. This isn't the debt total, the amount the government owes. This is the amount the government is adding to its debt every single year. And so the goal is to reduce that debt deficit, to reduce the amount borrowed each year just to keep the current lights on, bills paid, by about 1 in 6. About 1/6 of that is going to go down, and that's going to require 22 billion to be raised. Again, this is something that many places have been saying would have to happen, and so it's not that big of a surprise. But what is a surprise is saying that this is still going to go ahead without necessarily saying exactly what it will be. So what are the likely candidates? Well, I think it'd be useful to look at this because a lot of people think about taxes as all being equal. Like, yeah, you pay tax here and tax there, and but ultimately there are three taxes which make up almost all of the UK government revenue. 276 billion was raised in the 2023/24 tax year by income tax. This is the biggest one of all of them, but national insurance raises almost a similar amount, which seems wacky because for high earners you pay 2% national insurance versus 40% income tax, but even for lower earners it's 9% national insurance versus 20% income tax, and 12% versus 20% for most employees that aren't self-employed. And so you might be then saying, like, okay, how does this raise so much? The answer is they tax your employer for employing you. Your employer pays huge national insurance surcharges, which is in theory to pay for the NHS, but it's a tax on employment, so this is a huge one. And then VAT is the 20% tax on everything, which means the government makes a 20% cut every time you buy something on your, by the way, post-income tax and post-national insurance income. So there is a huge amount of money that is raised just by the government being involved in the most basic transactions, because everyone needs to work, or the majority of people need to work, everyone needs to buy things, and most people need to work and be employed in some way. And so these are the three big ones, but there's also corporation, and these are the three ones they can't raise, and so they need to raise an extra 22 billion from either corporation tax, council tax doesn't necessarily go to the government in a big way, but business rates, fuel duties, capital gains tax, etc, etc. But they need to raise one of these taxes, and with the exception being corporation tax, where you could raise the rate like 3 or 4%, most of these taxes don't allow for 22 billion to be raised without drastic changes. Take alcohol over here, for example. Alcohol taxes would have to triple just to fill that hole, and alcohol is already quite expensive without that, or you would have to take oil and gas taxes and like quadruple them. It's very, very hard to raise 22 billion while only playing around with the small taxes, whereas you could raise, say, income tax by an extra 2% or something like that and get there, which is where a bit of a problem starts to come in. And so I kind of want to talk more about what they can actually do with regards to fixing it, what the likely solutions are, because there is something fun in there, but I want to talk about the popularity element of this first, because I think that's just as interesting, because you might notice, in fact, one of the fun things to me is the fact that almost immediately after taking charge, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who is in charge of having all of these extra tax rises, is actually having a huge unfavorability increase. As you can see, unfavorability went from around 20% to around 40%, because people are like, wait, this person is raising the taxes? I don't like that at all. The only major tax rise so far has been VAT on private school fees, which is a very, very niche expense for a very niche percent of the population, but it still is like, okay, Labour government raising the taxes, not liking them very much, which is a problem for Keir Starmer too. You can see that his unfavorability has gone up quite a bit. It's literally, this is the crazy thing about polarization to some extent. The moment the campaign period ends, the amount that people don't like the Prime Minister versus do like the Prime Minister starts to have a big sharp incline again. There's a little honeymoon period where you're like, he's the Prime Minister, and then back on the decline, which is bad, I think it goes without saying. The only people who seem to like Keir Starmer more are Conservative voters, Liberals, which is very, very intriguing, right? But most voters from most parties are not a fan of the current government, which is a bad thing if you are trying to be liked, which is a good goal for governments to have. So with that said, one of the things that now needs to be done is, and I think a lot of people, by the way, will say, like, well, okay, we need to raise 22 billion. I'd be willing to raise my taxes if it paid for something good. But there's a really interesting study they did on this. It's from Tax Policy Associates. This is from a fairly high up member from the Labour National Executive Committee who actually studies in tax policy. And, despite being presumably some amount left-wing to be a member of the Labour Party, he's fairly admitting of the fact that, yeah, everyone says they'd be willing to pay additional tax for the NHS, say. You can see that it's about half of people, it's actually slightly fewer, who actually want taxes increased. But when you look amongst people who do want to raise taxes, you can see that the majority of those are in the older brackets where they're not actually paying taxes. If you say, should taxes be increased to pay for additional NHS funding, they'd say yes, because they use a lot of NHS and don't pay a lot of taxes. And so you can see that the people who do pay the most taxes are the ones who say, yeah, let's not increase those. We're spending a lot of money, 276 billion a year collectively. And so what's really interesting is if you ask people who do support higher tax, so don't ask people who don't want to pay higher tax, just those who say they will, how much extra will you pay a year? Around 30% say £10. £10 is the amount of extra tax they pay, which is basically a rounding error, right? £100 is a fair amount more. £100 times 70 million people. You've got about 7 billion a year, but that's where 80 to 90% of people across all parties say their willingness to pay extra tax ends. You can see that even amongst the highest earners, you can see that it's still like, yeah, around the majority of people earning more than 60,000 aren't willing to pay more than £100 a year. And what the Labour government are proposing is not just £100 per person. By the way, taxpayers aren't everyone in the UK, so it would have to be £300 per person, but also that's £300 per person, so per taxpayer, more like £600, about 6 times what even people who say they want more tax would like to pay, which is a big policy problem. This is kind of the, I guess maybe one of the issues of politics, is the people who are in charge of making people happy to get them to vote for them are also in charge of the financial decisions that make things smart or not smart, which is why we end up with a budget deficit of £120 billion, which is interesting because if you look at government spending, this is a crazy coincidence. £120 billion is how much the UK has to borrow each year just to meet its expenditure. But if you look at our expenditure, funnily enough, around 116 billion, just slightly less than that, is spent on debt interest. We borrow money every year so that we can pay the interest on money we borrowed previously. A lot of people think that we're borrowing money to invest in the future. No, we are borrowing money to pay the debt from all that investing in the future. Air quotes, but realistically, social protection that we actually spent money on. We borrowed a bunch of money to give to people, and then we keep moving the problem towards people from the future, which is a very hard problem to solve. Even if you reduce the deficit by 20 billion, even if you reduce the amount you have to borrow each year just to pay the amount that you're borrowing each year, even if you can do that, it's not only going to be unpopular, as again the Chancellor is finding out, but also it's going to be very hard to actually make a dent in the ridiculous size of the UK debt. And ultimately, even though some people will look at that and say, yeah, it was the right call, what people actually feel much more is when this doesn't feel correct. When people look at this and say, oh, my tax is up by £1,000, as for some people it would have to go up if it's £600 per taxpayer, a lot of people are going to feel like they're paying money, and that money is going into a black hole, because it's not going into social protections today, it's going into social protections or defense or education or transport or health or personal social services, or maybe if you're feeling really crazy, the public order and safety and housing and environment of 10 to 15 to 20 to, in some cases, like 50, 60 years ago. And that is the very sad thing about the system that we have, is the people in charge who could fix it, but it might be a very, very unpopular fix. And so what will be done instead? Well, here are the actual tax rises you might see. So here is, again, from the same, admittedly, it is a biased source towards the left of the, because it is a member of the Labour Party who is talking about this, but it is someone who understands tax in a way that I think is very useful. So if you look through their analysis of what they could actually do, here are the major ways they can raise some of that money. They can stop pension tax relief. At the moment, you get the full pension tax relief based on how much you earn, which goes up to 45% if you earn above 125k. They could reduce that down to 30% or 20%, and that would discourage people from saving money into their pension. But also, if they save the same amount of money in their pension, it would raise a lot of money for the government. But it would discourage people from saving into their pension kind of pushing a problem down the road a bit and maybe being a problem more broadly. So there's also limiting inheritance tax reliefs, which sounds really good, but really you don't raise that much by doing it. 2 billion of the 22 billion. Pensions, inheritance tax reform. When you die before age 75, your pension just transfers to whoever else is out there, tax-free. But if you're over 75, there is a 45% tax, potentially. And so it's a very, very expensive thing, but there's not a lot of money to be raised there. Increasing capital gains, which, by the way, technically speaking, Rachel Reeves has said she will not do. For some reason, she doesn't seem to rule it out. If you look over here, she's like, yeah, we rule out all of the things, but if you look more interestingly here, you can see that they haven't ruled out increasing inheritance tax, capital gains tax, or reforming tax relief on pensions. So that's why these are the three big things being mentioned here. But yeah, it's not a lot of money to be raised there. Stamp duty loophole for envelope commercial property. Okay, well, eliminating loopholes seems good, so that's sure, I guess. Basically, there's just not a lot of money to be raised by raising basically anything. If you raise fuel duty, it's 3 billion. If you deal with asset disposal relief, it's 1.5 billion. Vehicle exercise duty is only 200 million. There is, or even the pension tax-free sum is this is something which a lot of pensioners would immediately hate you for, and ultimately it could raise some money, or tax gambling winnings like in the US or some other countries do. But there are lots of ways that they can raise money, and individually they're all very unpopular with a group of people, and you need to do a lot of them together. So the UK is going to have a very unpopular set of tax policies that aren't going to go towards, fixing, aren't going to go towards something, people could at least get behind, like the NHS or whatever. They're going to go behind borrowing slightly less money. Because if the UK was balancing a budget, not saying that's a normal thing to do, I say you should have a balanced budget and then invest into infrastructure, is my opinion, but you'd have to raise taxes £120 billion, so about 6 times more. The equivalent of, if we look at our fun graph, raising VAT by, you'd have to go up to 32% or something like that, or raising income tax by a solid third, whatever you're paying right now, add another 33% to that. It is going to be very unpopular because people don't like paying taxes. This is the controversial take I want to get across in this video, is that a lot of people, you'll read about this online when people talk about the success and it's a particularly important thing for people who believe in tax and spend government, which is traditionally a left-wing thing, but is increasingly becoming popular on the right. Tax and spend sounds like the good idea because people love government things that come from it. But the reality is what people actually want is not like, oh, please government, take a bunch of money from me and then use it for things that I want. People believe that they're spending their half of their money pretty well right now. People believe that that's going pretty fine, but that the government take all of this money and then what do you really see for £245 billion in a year? What do you really see for 341 billion of social protection? Do you feel socially protected? Do you feel like if you lost your job tomorrow that you would actually be protected in a meaningful way? Or do you feel like that money is being used to buy the votes of certain groups that the government doesn't want to deal with in other ways? The things that most people might say are important to them, I'm not a big defense hawk person, but people believe in defense or in transport. A lot of people like education and think that that is the future. And indeed, I would say public order and safety is particularly important right now. The things that people would say are important to them are very small slices of the pie, and the things that people believe are perhaps giant handouts to people who already have a lot can be the very large slices of the pie. But such is the struggle of the UK public spending. We have a lot of money that is spent every single year, and a lot of that increasingly is going on spending for previous years. And so the easiest way for any government, the easiest pledge to fix that hole where people want big things from government but also don't want to pay for it, is what if you pay a bunch of money from the future? What if you just borrow more money? And so that is what has happened for a very, very long time, leading to a debt interest which makes up 10% of all current government spending. Every single time you pay VAT in a store, or every time you pay national insurance or income tax or council tax, that tax could be 10% lower if we didn't borrow to fix it in the future. And funnily enough, the easiest way to fix that now is to raise taxes. But I also think that that's going to be so wildly unpopular that even fixing 1/6 of the budget hole in the finances is going to lead to a huge decline in the Labour government's popularity. Will they still do it regardless is the interesting question though. And which of the many unpopular calls will they have to make? I think think personally, if I had to make my guess, just pure analysis here, I think that you come out saying you need to raise a huge amount of money, and then when you make some of these small reforms, when you make just a few of these tiny changes, when you decide that you're going to limit, pension tax relief, or when you're going to make, pension, the way that pensions pass through inheritance tax slightly harder, when you make these very small changes by themselves, they seem like a relief, but that means that the UK does have a big looming problem, but I don't think we're dealing with it right now. So, yeah, just a fun reminder, the votes are the thing that politicians love, and the things that seemingly do make them lose it is is that you probably don't want to take people's money in exchange for that. You want to give them the money, not take the money. But ultimately, where does the government's money come from? There's a question there for something. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. It was a fun little one to dive into tax rises. And if you want to learn more about politics and the world and everything else, make sure you subscribe. I'm just kidding. Second channel. Don't care. Bye.